Revelation chapter 17 is where we're going to be this evening. Deanna moved to the back so I can scoot back closer to y'all tonight. Keep Elton in line. Good to see everybody. Good to see Jared and Jara feeling better and able to be back with us. I know y'all have had a rough last week or so, but glad that y'all are improving and doing better. Byron, would you lead our prayer tonight?
Holy Father in heaven, holy and hallowed be thy name. We're grateful, Holy Father, for this time that we come and spend and study thy word. Yes, I bless you to be one Joshua, so he sets forth thy word to us this evening. We are grateful to thee, Holy Father, for our healing hand and much our number of great people. We ask thy blessing to be upon thee, Holy Father, and the study of thy word, that all we do and say be in accordance with thy will. Forgive us our sins, so we ask the Lord in Christ's name.
Amen. Revelation chapter 17. We're going to begin tonight by looking at the first 3 verses. And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials and talked with me, saying, Come unto me, come hither. I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So chapter 17 is a continuation of this image that we've been seeing in the last couple of chapters. These 7 angels that were given the 7 bowls or the 7 vials that were filled with God's wrath. One of those angels calls out to John and says, Come with me. I want to show you something. He said, I'm going to show you the judgment of the great harlot that sitteth on many waters. Now the King James Version here uses the term or refers to this woman as a whore. But since this word is seen today as what we commonly call a cuss word or a swear word, we're going to use the term harlot in our conversation tonight because it has the same meaning. And I know that there are many people that have some qualms about the use of that original term. Now there's some dispute as to what exactly is being referred to. There's some dispute in the religious world as to who this is referring to would be the recipient of God's wrath. Well, we look at the characteristics of this symbolic woman, and we compare her to the things that we've already studied about the Roman Empire. Well, when we do this, it leaves little doubt as to who this is referring to. This angel goes to great length in this chapter. And as we look at chapter 17, we're going to find that this is one of the most descriptive of all the chapters that we find in the book of Revelation. Because remember, and we've talked about this previously, as you study through the book of Revelation, you see a progression. It starts out very simple in these visions. These signs and symbols were ones that were fairly easy to understand. But then over time, you see more and more details that are being set forth. Well, what we're going to see in chapter 17, by the time we get to the end of this chapter, if there's any doubt in your mind as to who it is that's going to be destroyed, it will have been taken away by the end of this chapter. The angel is going to remove all doubt as to who this scarlet woman is in reference to. In fact, keep this verse in mind as we go through this chapter. Revelation 17, verse 18. says, "And the woman which thou sawest is that great city, which reigneth over the kings of the earth." There was only one city on earth in the first century that fit that bill. Only one city could lay claim to that type of description. So as we see from that description alone, this symbolic woman has to be in reference to Rome. So with this in mind, let's take a look at some of the characteristics that are revealed to John about this woman. And I want you to notice just how many similarities there are between the description that's given to John and what we know about Rome. Well, starting out in verse 1, we see that she is introduced to us as a harlot, a prostitute. In verse 5, notice it says that labeled on her forehead is the description, Mother of the Harlots. Well, being the mother of harlots indicates that she was responsible for the procreation of the false doctrines, the false teachings that she was engaging in. Now keep in mind, in this sense, it's not talking about physical prostitution, it's talking about spiritual prostitution. And we've talked in a previous sense, what this is saying is that essentially those that were bowing down to the emperor, they were committing adultery against God. They were cheating on God. Well, harlotry in this case, it's talking about spiritual fornication. Having that bond, having that connection with someone or something other than God. Well, we've already seen in great detail two entities. We had them personified as two beasts, one that came forth from the sea and one that came from the land. We saw those characteristics and how they fit so well. The first with the emperor of Rome, and the second with his military force that went about enforcing the worship of the emperor. They were charged with making sure that people were going along with those charges, and if they weren't, then they had the right to punish those individuals. But notice, as we see in reference to this woman, notice that it says that she is trying to force herself upon the citizens. She's trying to make them give in to what she wants them to do. And so here we have this image of a woman who, by her actions, she's leading people away from God. She's bringing about spiritual fornication, promoting spiritual harlotry, and that is in the form of worship of the emperor. But then notice that it talks about that she is sitting upon many waters. Well, if we skip down to verse 15, and we're going to jump around quite a bit in this chapter trying to get a proper understanding. But if we move down to verse 15, we see an explanation of this idea of sitting upon many waters. It said, "And he saith unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the harlot sitteth, are peoples, and multitudes, and nations, and tongues." Several times you've heard me say in our study of Revelation that oftentimes if you just keep on reading, a lot of times the book will interpret itself. Well, that's what we see here. We start out this idea of a woman sitting upon many waters. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't go out here and sit on water. I'm going to sink. And that's just, that's common. That's the common idea and understanding that people have. But when this image is given there and he sees this woman that is sitting upon many waters, this would have been confusing. And so verse 15 tells us that no, these many waters that you saw, this is referring to all of the different people, all the different nationalities, all of those that spoke all of these different tongues. What this is saying is that this was impacting everyone in the Roman Empire. Now the Romans, one thing that they tried to do, and this was a carryover from the Greeks, The Greeks, when they came in and conquered many of these nations, they tried to enforce what they referred to as Hellenization. And what that meant was they tried to go in and they tried to get everyone to come under one unified language. They tried to get everyone to lay aside their personal traditions and all live their life in one certain way. And somewhat, we still see that same type of attitude with many Americans today. Because how many times have we heard people say, if you're going to live in America, you need to act like an American. You need to speak English. You need to dress like we do. You need to act like we do. How many times have we heard those kinds of things? A lot. Well, that ideology is not something that is unique to America. It's something that we see started with the Greeks. Now, the Romans, they were a little less intense in their promotion of this. They still wanted everyone, at least when it came to their political business and transacting business, they wanted everyone to deal in a Roman fashion. And we've talked some on Sunday morning when the Pharisees, they came to Jesus and they asked him if they were supposed to pay their taxes to Caesar. And I talked about the fact that under the Roman system, the Jews, they were allowed to function as their own society. They had their own currency. They had their own traditions, their ways of doing things. And we know this because you remember when Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple, the reason they were there was so that those individuals coming to Jerusalem to worship and pay their temple taxes would be able to convert whatever foreign currency they were bringing into Hebrew currency. But do you remember what happened when Jesus asked them for a coin? What did they give him? They gave him a Roman coin. They didn't give him a Hebrew coin. They gave him a Roman coin. And so this was something that was quite common. In official business, it was always to be transacted according to the traditions of the Romans. But notice in this passage that we see, it said that this influence was widespread. Those in the Roman Empire, all of the nations that were there were many different languages that were spoken, many different nationalities. Folks, the Roman Empire at one time stretched all the way from northern Africa as far as the British Isles. I mean, this was a very, very large empire. It stretched into what we refer to as the Middle East, over in the areas Iran, Iraq. Very, very vast area of land. And not everyone spoke the same language. But that influence was permeating the whole empire. Because they were considered Roman citizens, and therefore, in order to have all the rights of Roman citizenry, they had to bow down and worship the emperor. And so that was something that was widespread. This concilia, this police force, they traveled throughout the empire. They didn't stay right around the city of Rome. They traveled throughout the empire, trying to force the worship of the emperor. But then, with all this in mind, it brings us into verse 2. Notice here the angel says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. So this woman that is pictured here as seated upon many waters, it says she is the one that many of the kings of the earth have committed fornication with. Well, the key is the two words, with whom. With whom? Well, one party in that is going to be this Scarlet woman. The other party is going to be the many waters. All of those entities that made up the Roman Empire. And therefore, this is why, as we come down, we see this description of her being the mother of harlots, or the mother of harlotry. Because what she was forcing upon the empire. was that which was spreading. It was starting with her and then was spreading from that initial influence. But keep in mind, as we look through these verses, what he is being shown is proof that Rome is the one that's going to be punished. That's the whole message here, is helping John and those Christians in the first century, helping them to know without a shadow of a doubt that Rome is the one being punished, and this is why they're being punished. They're being punished because they are following their leaders into idolatry. You know, that's something that many of them were familiar with, wasn't it? Especially the ones that came from a Jewish background. Because you go back and especially you look during the time of the Judges. You know, we just finished a series of lessons on Gideon. When God determined that he was going to use Gideon to deliver that nation had completely turned their back on God because they thought God has abandoned us. God has fulfilled everything he's going to do for us, and so why would we turn to him for any kind of blessings? But then you may remember in our lesson Sunday morning, I mentioned the fact that by the time that Gideon reached the end of his life, that nation was already back worshiping idols again. Even after all the miraculous things that God did to deliver them and to prove himself to them, they fell back into idolatry again. And so this idea of being punished because of idolatry was not something that was new. It was something they were familiar with. And so they were able to look at their history and the times that God had punished their nation, and they were able to see, well, that's what God's about to do to Rome. Rome has turned away from God. They're trying to force us to turn away from God. They're going to be destroyed. Any questions or comments? I've been talking for almost 20 minutes, so any questions or comments up to this point? All right, verse 3 says, "So he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." So here, remember John, when he's receiving this revelation, he is in exile. He is on the prison island of Patmos. He's been banished there. And you know, we see at the beginning of Revelation, he talks about that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Now, we don't know the length of time that these revelations were revealed to him. It could be that he received all of these in one 24-hour period. It could be that it was stretched out over a time. But we know that he received all of these visions while he was there on that island. So notice it says that he was taken in the Spirit. This angel did not come and take his physical body and carry it off of this island and take it out into the wilderness. He said this angel took me in the Spirit, took me out into the wilderness, took me away from this windswept prison island. And there I was in the wilderness, and I looked, and there was that woman. That woman that we've already seen seated upon many waters, but this time she's now seated on an animal. She's seated upon a scarlet-colored beast. Now remember, in talking about colors in the book of Revelation, red was often seen as the color of war, the color of bloodshed. But here this woman, seated upon this scarlet-colored beast. Well, it's very similar to the image that we saw in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 1. The scarlet color would indicate that this beast was one that was deadly, was one that had great power and great authority. This indicated by its 7 heads and 10 horns. Well, the 7 heads are later described, as we'll see in verses 9 and 10. It says, "Here is the mind that hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth, and they are 7 kings." You go back and you look at the city of Rome, at least the area of land that was occupied by the city of Rome at the time that this revelation was being given to John. The ancient city of Rome was founded upon 7 hills. And so he gives us the interpretation here. He said these 7 heads, he said it's 7 hills. Well, of course, they're going to think, what's the only city we know of that has that kind of power, that is spewing forth blasphemy of turning away from God, but also what city is founded upon 7 hills? And immediately they were going to know this is talking about Rome. This is talking about the seat of government over this entire empire. Well, this idea that this beast had 7 heads, or a perfect number of heads, and had 10 horns, indicating perfect or complete worldly authority, indicates that it could only be talking about the emperor. He was the one that had this authority. He was the one that was handing this down. Well, this scarlet woman, though, was the one that was directing his actions. This scarlet woman. So keep that in mind. Well, continuing on, it said that this beast, that it was full of names of blasphemy. Well, this would be a reference to the names that the beast called himself. You may remember that we've talked in a previous lesson about the fact that Domitian required that he be introduced, that he be referred to as Lord God Domitian. It'd be kind of like today when we refer to someone, take for instance a judge in a court of law, they're referred to as Your Honor. And you know, those are terms of respect that are given to those in that position. And there's nothing wrong in that type of setting to refer to them that way. But where the issue arose with Domitian was he was demanding that he be referred to as God. It wasn't enough to just be given some sign of respect. It wasn't enough to be referred to as Caesar or Your Honor. He wanted to be referred to as God. Well, certainly this was blasphemous on his part. And anyone that referred to him as God was blaspheming the name of the one true God. And so, as it says, this beast, it was full of names of blasphemy. Once again, because he was the one that was causing people to do this. He was causing people to blaspheme God by requiring them to refer to him this way. And you know, I made reference in a previous lesson, and I think this is something that we need to keep in mind as well. You know, this is something that we still see practiced in certain religious groups today. Now, one of the official titles for the Pope of Rome is Lord God the Pope. That is in their official documentation. You see religious groups that refer to their leaders as Your Eminence or Your Holiness, things of that nature, titles that are reserved only for God. And the one that we see most common, and we talked about this a little bit on Sunday, the term reverend. You know, in the Bible, the term reverend, it says that reverend is God's name. It's not a name that's applied to man. And so it's blasphemous to refer to any person or anything by a title that is reserved for God. And so every time that Domitian required that someone bow to him, worship him, and refer to him as God, not only was he committing blasphemy, but the one that he led to do that, he was causing them to blaspheme God. And so he was full of names of blasphemy. Verse 4 says, "And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and decked with gold and precious stone and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, even the unclean things of her fornication." So in this image, this woman is arrayed as if she is some type of monarch, some type of a king or a queen. The color purple was that which was often reserved for royalty, or at least those who were extremely wealthy. The color scarlet also was seen as a sign of great authority and great respect, at least whenever it would be worn as a garment. But notice that it also talks about that she has these precious gems and stones and things of that nature that are drawing attention to her. People are looking at her and admiring her for the way that she has adorned herself. But then it takes a little bit of a change here, or a little twist. Notice it says that in her hand is a golden cup. But in that cup, it is full of abomination. Abomination is a very, very strong term for sin. Those things that God stands opposed to. But it said what is in her hand, the things that she is endorsing, that she is giving authority to do, these are all things that are abominable to God. And those that go along with it will be in sin. And notice that it says that within that cup is even the unclean things of her fornication, indicating that all of the evil that was taking place in that empire was coming from this entity, was coming forth from her authority. Now, I keep referring to her as a woman, but as we get further on down in this chapter, we're going to find that this is simply a symbol. It's not talking about an actual human female. But as we come down into verses 5 and 6, it says, "And upon her forehead a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of the harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great wonder." You know, I find myself quite often just standing in, not necessarily standing in awe, but just wondering, shaking my head when I think about the sinful condition that so many people find themselves in. When I look at the world around us and I see just how far away from God that it has gone, you know, it renders me speechless. Well, that's what John is saying here. He says, when I saw all of these things that's taking place because of her influence, he said, I wondered with great wonder. How could it get to this point? How could the person that is symbolized by this woman be that evil and have that much influence? Well, folks, I wish I could say that was an isolated incident. But there have been so many times in the history of the world where extremely wicked people had a profound impact on others, led so many other people down that same path of wickedness that they were engaging in. Well, notice God here is giving this description as an identification of this woman. He says that she is the main harlot, the main one that's practicing this abomination, this blasphemy against God. She is the main one that is responsible for the idolatry of the nation, and she is referred to as the Mother of Harlots. You know, if we go back to the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king of Babylon, and he made a statue that was roughly 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. He took this huge statue out and he set it up, and he demanded that all of those in that nation go out and bow before this statue. You remember in Daniel chapter 3, what did he say was going to happen to anybody that wouldn't do it? You know this story, folks. You learned it as a kid. What was going to happen? Fiery furnace. There you go. It was going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. Notice what the name of this scarlet woman is. Babylon the Great. Well, we know that it could not be referring to the literal city or nation of Babylon, because it had been destroyed many centuries before this time. When the Medes and the Persians came in and overthrew the Babylonian Empire, the city of Babylon lay in ruins. So we know it can't be referring to literal Babylon. But what did literal Babylon and the scarlet woman, the mother of harlots, have in common? What do we see in these two entities? Well, they shared several things in common. The emperor of Rome and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, tried to force their nations to bow down to a false entity. By force, by threats. The concilia, they had the authority to put people to death if they would not bow down to the emperor. Well, what did Nebuchadnezzar say? If you don't bow down before this statue, I'm going to throw you into a fiery furnace. They both were forcing things upon the citizens of their nation that were sinful. That authority was coming directly from them. Each of them made images that people were to bow before. Each of them tried to elevate themselves to a position that was above the authority that God had given to them. And as we see in Revelation 13 and verse 15, they had the power to put people to death that did not follow them. No, that authority didn't come from God, but they abused the authority that they did have in order to make it possible for them to do this. Folks, this was identical to what Nebuchadnezzar did in Babylon. Therefore, those who had a knowledge of Daniel and had a knowledge of the time of the Babylonian captivity, when they heard the name Babylon, immediately they were going to think back. And then when they saw all of these other things that were taking place, it was going to start clicking. This is what God's talking about. Rome is about to be punished for doing the very same thing that Babylon had done. And Babylon was destroyed by the Medes and Persians because they fell away into such decadence and hedonism, because they had become so ingrained in their idolatrous practices. And we don't have time to talk about it tonight, but it's a very interesting story of how the Medes were able to come in and easily destroy this nation. They waited until a time when all of the strong men in Babylon were passed out drunk, because they had been celebrating a feast to their false gods. That nation was overthrown because of sin. All right, we're going to stop there, and we'll talk about this some more next Wednesday night. So we've got some other information here from verse 3 that I want us to discuss.